Thank you, and thank you very much for this kind introduction. My title in Tartu is Professor of Urban and Population Geography, but I'm also a visiting professor at Delft University of Technology, and there I'm the Professor of Urban Inequalities and Segregation, and that's the title featured on this slide. And for 6 months, I'm working together with Maarten van Ham on issues of urban segregation and related fields. Right, the title is quite complex. I tried to elaborate on this. It is very much based on the research of the team, also led by Professor Maarten van Ham, where we study processes of neighborhood change, segregation, and mobility. And we try to kind of synthesize some of the knowledge in a more, maybe not in a way of theory, but kind of conceptual perspective as well. So the ideas are in the progress on the construction, so to say, and any feedback would be more than perfect. Anyway, what I will do today, I will focus on the issues of segregation and how it relates to the process of inequality and social mobility. There may be a couple of key takeaway messages I would like to communicate to you through my talk. Very often we talk about segregation in relation to the residential neighborhoods. But of course, segregation can take place in other places, in addition to place of residence at work, in education, in the leisure time. So segregation is a multi-dimensional phenomenon. And these different domains, residence, work, education, they are of course interconnected with each other. Segregation in one domain, for example, in residential neighborhoods, can be transmitted to education, labor market, and so forth. And that's from where our kind of concept of the vicious circle of segregation comes from. Still, segregation is like a macro level phenomenon. It characterizes neighborhoods or some kind of units, but this segregation emerges as a result of individuals moving around in the city, making their choices. So that's related to the sorting. The sorting means that where you buy your house, what kind of school you choose to study in, what kind of choices you make in the leisure time, and so forth. But also, in addition to the sorting, when you study somewhere, when you work somewhere, when you live somewhere, you get exposed to other people, you interact with them, and that also influences your further, later choices. For example, the people with whom you study may affect your choices later on the labor market. So segregation is a more like a macro level phenomenon, but it evolves as a result of individual choices and individual interactions in different activity sites. I will come to the terms in a moment more specifically. And maybe the final important takeaway message is that if this vicious circle segregation forms, it's also related to the level of social inequalities. And the higher are the social inequalities, the more likely it is that such a vicious circle segregation can form and operate in our cities. So these are the 5 main things I would like to come through in my today's talk. So when we talk about the concept of a vicious circle of segregation, we talk about 3 levels of analysis. These are domains, activity sites, and individuals and households. So again, with domains, we mean like broad areas in our life that relate to where we live, education, our educational kind of choices, our work choices, what we do in the leisure time. Like these are the domains in our life. But within the domains, we still visit very concrete places. Our home is one concrete place. Our school is a very concrete place where we go to study. The establishment where we work is a concrete place where we go to work. Or the pub where we go to leisure time is the concrete place that we visit in the leisure time. So we have like broad domains: residence, work, education, leisure, and activity sites, which are concrete places we visit on a daily basis. And of course, the individual level people themselves and their choices in the end are the main carriers of or transmitters of segregation from one domain to another. So I will now go through all these three levels one by one, starting from the most general level that we then call or name domains. So the domains are work, first three of them: work, residence, and education. And these three domains are related to each other in a systematic fashion. When we start from the work life, different people work in different occupations. When they work in different occupations, they earn different incomes. When they earn different incomes, they have different choice when it comes to the housing market. Those who have higher incomes have more choice. Those who have lower incomes have less choice. So the differences in the labor market through income are carried on to the housing market. Furthermore, if housing is market-based, housing sector is market-based, and where the ownership rate is high, and many people buy their homes by loans. So actually, through the loans, the income differences get even exaggerated or amplified. Those with higher income can take bigger loans, and those with smaller incomes maybe don't get a loan at all or can get only a small loan. So the loan system actually amplifies the differences from the labor market. So differences in the labor market then carry on to the housing market. From the housing market, differences carry on to the field of education through different mechanisms, to which I will come in a moment as well. One of them is very simple. Very often, in many countries, school districts are neighborhood-based. So kids go to the closest school nearby. So if the residential segregation occurs, rich people live in certain areas, poor people in other areas, ethnic minorities live in certain areas, native people in other areas. This difference in residential segregation carries on to the schools, and from schools again back to work. So that's like the main, most broad way how segregation is transmitted from one domain to the next, from work to home, from home to residence to education, and from education back to work. And of course, increasingly, an important additional domain in our life is leisure, because people spend more and more time out of work, out of studies. The amount of leisure time used in our time budgets has increased significantly over time. And leisure is, in a way, linked to all the three different domains. Because very often we go to the pub that is close to our home or close to the workplace. For children, many leisure time activities take place in schools or close to the schools. So the leisure time activities are very tightly connected. Of course, not only, but tightly connected to the three other domains. So let's just for a moment and to the start zoom into the domains as well and look what's going on within each of them from the perspective of segregation, or the operation of the vicious circle of segregation. That is the topic of my today's talk. So what we see that's taking place is that differences, inequalities, are increasing. We see that income inequality has been on the rise, and that's again confirmed by the last World Inequality report, and it pertains to all regions of the world. Europe has been less, the change has been the smallest in Europe, but still also in Europe we see a clear increase. And somewhere in the 80s the trend changed. Till then the inequalities globally decreased, but after the 80s there is a clear increase towards clear trends toward the increase. So, of course, there is a huge debate on what's exactly behind the increase of the income inequalities. But certainly, two factors are crucially important in this, and these are related to the globalization on the one hand and technology on the other hand. And what these two kind of factors, when put together, do is that they increase the demand for the highly skilled people, especially in the IT sector, but also in the other highly skilled sectors. In many countries, immigration policies, for example, they focus on the highly skilled. There's a so-called global hunt for talent, which rises the incomes in the highly skilled part of the labor force. On the other hand, the lower skilled people, they compete globally, and also in the high income countries they compete with people working in the low income countries, and that kind of has a kind of depressing effect on the incomes in the less skilled people. And these are maybe the two main kind of mechanisms that are behind the increase of the inequalities that we find over the last 3 decades, more or less across the globe. So, as that, when the differences in one domain, in work life, through incomes increase, we can expect that differences are transmitted to the housing sector, that will also trigger levels of residential segregation, meaning that wealthier people tend to concentrate into certain parts of the city, poor people to the other parts, minorities into some parts, and natives to the other parts. So what we can see, and that's a study that we have now, I present now, is conducted with a group of people in different cities and universities across Europe, shows is that the levels of segregation really have changed as well in the cities, and they have increased. First, let us look at the segregation between top and bottom socioeconomic groups, simply put, between poor and rich. In the year 2001, it was a census round from where we have comparable data from different countries, and the bars show us, and the figures show us, what is the percentage of one or the other group who has to change neighborhood in order to achieve the equal distribution of the groups. So when the value for Riga is 20, it shows that either 20% of the rich or poor have to change their neighborhood in order to achieve equal distribution of rich and poor in Riga. So what we see from this graph is that European cities used to be quite moderately segregated. And also what we see is quite a clear pattern across European countries with East and North European countries being on the left-hand side, and the South and West European countries being on the right-hand side. In other words, levels of segregation in the residential neighborhoods were much lower in East and North Europe, and much higher in south and west. The next data point that is available for all countries is from the last census round from the 2011, and this is now depicted with the brown bars. And the most important message that the figure now communicates is that the brown bars are taller than the blue bars, meaning that the levels of segregation has increased almost across the board, almost in all European countries. Poor people really live more concentrated in certain parts of the city, and wealthier people live in the different parts of the city. So segregation has increased. There is one small exception here on the graph. You see the city? Mm-hmm. Yes, so it's the one closest to you, that's Amsterdam. So for the Amsterdam, you see the decrease of segregation. However, the authors of the Amsterdam chapter, Sako Mustard and his colleagues, still explain that the mechanisms are the same in Amsterdam that sort people, but the outcome is different. And sometimes it can happen when, for example, the process of gentrification is very intense. So what does gentrification mean? It means that that higher income groups move to the lower income areas. And temporarily, the mix can actually increase, and segregation levels, as a consequence, decrease as well. But usually it's a temporary phenomenon, and rich people kind of push lower income people out, and segregation levels start to rise again. So it's called also the segregation paradox. Sometimes it's so that when inequalities rise and high income groups move to the low income areas, segregation levels can temporarily go down. And that's what we see in case of Amsterdam. But the process is quite the same across Europe as well. That the high income groups more and more move to the central parts of the city, and the so to say suburbanization of poverty takes place as the low income groups are more and more kind of pushed out from the city centers. Also what we see is that the very clear east-west kind of divide has become smaller. For example, in Tallinn we see a very big rise of segregation and so on. But I will not stay or discuss these details. The main message is clear: segregation levels in European cities have grown across the board. So when we, as a next step, match the levels of inequality and the levels of residential segregation, we don't get a perfect match. As you see here, this similarity index measures the segregation in places of residence, and Gini index measures then social inequalities. So we see that social and spatial inequalities, they are not perfectly matched. I mean, in cities with the same level of inequality, segregation levels can vary a lot, from very low levels in Oslo up to very high levels in Stockholm. But also here, I mean, among the highly socially, with very high levels of social inequality, segregation levels vary a lot. So there is not a perfect match, although we see that there's some kind of trend here, but the match is not perfect. So as a next step, we asked, why is it so? Why we don't see a kind of perfect correlation between the level of social inequality on the one hand, so how big are the income differences, and spatial inequality, whether rich and poor live in different parts of the city or not. And as a next step, then we introduced time lags into the data. Because, as said, if segregation is transmitted from one domain to another, there's some kind of time lag needed to measure this change. And so what we did, we now contrast the levels of spatial segregation with social inequalities 10 years earlier. Because we expect that if inequalities rise, the difference between low and high income groups increase. It takes a bit of time before we see also change in the residential segregation, because it takes time before rich people sort into certain neighborhoods and poor people sort into the other neighborhoods. And yes, if we do like this, we see that there is quite a clear correlation between the changes of inequality and segregation. Inequalities, again, they are measured 10 years earlier than segregation levels. They tend to increase first, and with time lag, levels of spatial segregation do follow. It's quite consistent, but what's also interesting, the correlation works in both ways. Namely, in South Europe, social inequalities decreased in the 80s. And that's the blue line. And 10 years later, residential segregation also decreased. And then in the 90s, social inequalities increased, and 10 years later, residential segregation increased as well. So it works both ways. If social inequalities increase, with time lag, segregation increases. If social inequalities go down, segregation levels also go down with a 10-year time lag. We can't measure it more accurately because, again, we don't have annual data to say how much exactly we have to lag. But at least this 10-year lag shows that there is a clear correlation. Finally, one interesting example is in Budapest, where in 1980s the social inequalities increased, but in 1990s segregation levels decreased. But again, it's this segregation paradox. It sometimes is so that when social inequalities go up, high-income groups move to the low-income areas, and it temporarily can reduce segregation levels. But yet again, after a bit longer time lag, you see that residential segregation kind of starts to increase as well. So certainly, when we introduce the time lag, we see that there is a very clear correlation between change in inequality first, followed by the change in residential segregation thereafter. As said, education is very much influenced by residential segregation, just purely because of the fact that the kids very often go to the nearest school. Usually the school catchment areas are drawn around the neighborhood. It varies a bit between the country, but as a rule of thumb, it is so. So that the residential segregation very obviously kind of translates into the field of education. It's just this geographic aspect, but also the sorting of people with different incomes, but also educations, affects the educational choices of the kids as well. Because parents with high education, they also value education more, and maybe people with lower education, they value education a bit less. So we see that there is a very strong correlation between the levels of education and their parents, and also that what's interesting, the higher the inequality in society, the bigger the difference is. So in high-income societies, for low-income, low-educated parents, it's more difficult for their children to achieve a better education. So inequality and educational choice and how it transmits from parents to kids is very clearly correlated. And again, if these people with different education sort in different neighborhoods, and if schools are neighborhood-based, again, the residential segregation gets very clearly transmitted into schools and in the field of education. So that's the broadest level, what we call then domains, that pertains place of residence, work, education, and leisure. But as I said, in real life, people visit very concrete places. They have a home in a very concrete place, They go to a school, into a very concrete school, and they go to work into a very concrete enterprise. And that's what we call then as a kind of meso level between individual and these big domains. And as people move around in the city and visit these different sites, the activity space of the person emerges. When people start their activities usually from home, sometimes from another place, but usually from home. And from home, they go to school or to work or the pub, and hopefully in the evening they go back to home. So the activity sites are the more concrete locations within all the domains. Right. And then individuals then navigate their daily lives between these activity sites. From their home, they go to school, from school maybe through the whatever leisure time activity site, doing some sports, for example, going back to home. So people navigate their daily trajectories in urban space through the activity sites. Which brings us, of course, now to the level of individuals and how individuals sort into these activity sites and what kind of effects they get from these activity sites while they interact with other people, have a beer with someone in the pub or studying together with someone or working together and so forth. And just an example of one of our data that we have collected based on the mobile phones. We can nowadays also track very accurately how people navigate in the urban space and what kind of trajectories emerge as they do so. So the yellow dots are people moving around, and the red corridors show what kind of streets are mainly used, and we can also see in which concrete places people went to. And if we overlay it with GIS data, with the location of homes or pubs or workplaces or schools, we know actually quite accurately where people went. And if these different colors represent different groups, for example, rich and poor people, or ethnic minorities and natives, we can get already a very kind of detailed overview how different groups use the urban space, what are the trajectories on the one hand, and the concrete sites that they visit, and who are the other people in these sites that they visit, and whom they can potentially interact while being there. So the level of segregation, the fact that poor people are sorted into certain neighborhoods, for example, and rich people are sorted into different neighborhoods, or ethnic minorities into some, and natives to the other, it rises, this macro level pattern rises as a result of two types of mechanisms. One is related to the individuals sorting into activity sites. Again, what kind of choices they do, where they want to live, where they buy or rent their house, what kind of school they decide to go, or where they are accepted or enrolled to, what kind of choices they do there on the labor market. And as we already said, from place of residence and schools, an intergenerational jump takes place because parents choose their place of residence, and that affects the school choice of their kids. So a generation jump takes place as segregation is transmitted from place of residence to schools. So the individual sorting has clearly the intergenerational dimension. And then the other important fact is then the kind of exposure to other people, as said, and with whom people actually interact when they study, when they work, and spend their leisure time. So these effects that people get from being in concrete activity sites or in domains, we call contextual effects. Right. this kind of environment where we are, and we get some kind of effect from being in this environment, in some kind of educational system, in the labor market system, or in a concrete activity site. And the most important, like a macro level determinant that affects the sorting of people into different residential neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and other time activity sites relates to the socio-economic inequalities. So let's assume two different contexts. One is a low inequality context. And here, these three lines are quite close to each other. The so to say, social distance between the poor bottom socioeconomic group and top socioeconomic group is relatively short. Which means that it's quite easy in such context to undertake social spatial mobility. For example, the education of kids is not that dependent on the education of the parents, for example. So it's relatively easy to undertake social mobility, to move from one level to the next one. So now let's assume a different context where the inequality is big. Now the lines are much more spread than in this example. So now the mobility, both social, getting a better education, or moving to a different neighborhood is much more difficult. For example, because the house prices vary more, or the transmission of educational differences is much more strict and much more related to the kids' outcomes are much more related to the parents' outcome. So if you make now an equal effort to the previous example, you don't get to the next level. Maybe you fall down. You need to make a bigger effort to reach the next level. So the higher are the inequalities in the society, the more difficult it is to change our social position, also intergenerationally, or the spatial position, because, for example, the house prices vary much more than in the low inequality context. So certainly the level of inequality is very much related to the sorting of people through the income differences. And it's much more difficult, once again, to undertake social and spatial mobility in high inequality context compared to the low inequality context. Oh, sorry. So, to sum up, what I try to kind of communicate to you is that segregation is clearly a multi-dimensional phenomenon. We usually focus on places of residence, but actually the levels of segregation can and do get transmitted between different domains from places of residence, work, education, and also leisure. So they are very connected, systematic. Income differences translate into housing differences translate into educational differences, and educational differences again translate into the labor market differences. And that's how the kind of vicious circle of segregation operates. It operates through the individual sorting. Well, income is very important, but also maybe preferences. Maybe for minorities also discrimination. There can be some discrimination on the rental sector or whatever. But it's the individual sorting on the one hand into concrete activity sites, schools, workplaces, and homes, and to which other people get exposed to and with whom they communicate in the other activity sites. The higher the level of inequality is, the more likely it is that such a vicious circle of segregation starts to operate, and also to have a very clear such an intergenerational transmission, as the outcomes of the kids are very much dependent on their parents and how well educated they are, and then what are their incomes. Thank you.
I'm sure actually there are some questions to be answered, right? Or anybody? Here.
Yes, in your theory you really focus on European cities, but in the introduction you told us that inequality worldwide is kind of rising. Does it also follow these patterns, this circle, or does it work in kind of a different way?
In cities, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I mean, the kind of rule of thumb is, unfortunately, we can't measure in many cities inequalities. We don't have this measure readily available. But as a rule of thumb, it's very clear: the bigger the city, the higher the inequalities. So usually in the large cities, the level of inequalities is bigger than the average of the country. So that this kind of contextual effects for the formation of the segregation circle are very much there in big cities.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe this is what we're going to do in the workshop, so maybe it's a redundant question. But what would you advise policymakers to do about this?
Yeah, you have to, I mean, the first thing is that since the level of inequality is still a very important kind of underlying thing that shapes the segregation and how it's transmitted from one activity site or domain to the other, that's certainly something that policies should address. That's for sure. And it is problematic. And we see that the very big, also economic powerhouses, starting from OECD and IMF, they very much understand it, but it's very difficult to tackle it because of this globalization of the labor markets, the strong role of international companies. Very often countries compete for getting big international companies into their country, offering tax reductions, whatever benefits. So it's very difficult actually to do something to kind of reduce the inequality. But that's something for sure that needs to be addressed. That's the underlying thing. Then of course urban planning as well. I mean, if you still try to do more mixing, then it's also in whatever domain. Because what's good? I mean, on the one hand, it's bad. Segregation is transmitted from one domain to the other. But on the other hand, it's also good because if you are able to improve whatever element in the system, it kind of already has an effect to the other elements. Again, the problem here is that if inequalities grow bigger and bigger, the more difficult becomes also mixing. For example, think about a low inequality context. Everyone is driving Skoda. I mean, there is no problem in mixed people. I mean, still they look same in the same neighborhood. If it's a high income, high inequality context, some people drive with Porsche and some with 10, 20 years old Skoda. And when you now bring these people together in the same neighborhood, I mean, the contrast is really big. The children of the poor family see how different life is in the family of the rich people. And we see in the studies that it can actually bring along stress among the poor people. So also the mixing becomes more and more difficult, the bigger is the inequality. So mixing helps, but when the inequality is not too big. Otherwise it can lead to a new stress and new problems. Yeah, please.
Which domain do you think is best suited to begin to tackle this inequality?
I've thought about it a lot, and I think it's the answer is really straightforward. If we think about the three big domains, residence, work, and schools, the housing market, and the labor market, they operate based on that market principles. Schools is the domain where public sector has a leading role. It's not determined by the market. So for sure, schools is the most obvious place to make some kind of a change.
And how do you see it with leisure? Because I was thinking about leisure, and that is already
leisure is
a little bit of mixing people.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Exactly. I mean, leisure is, I didn't talk about it a lot because leisure is a bit different from the other domains because it's actually sum total of very different things. About religion, about pubs, about sports, visiting urban, I mean, it's whatever. And some of these are really segregative and some are more like integrated activities. And so in leisure time you should kind of think about these more integrative types of activities. Religion is very segregated because if you have different religious groups, they practice different religions, they go to different facilities. I mean, no integration there. But when it comes to maybe sports or some other activities,
football.
Yeah, exactly. So it's much more efficient. So leisure is really a more diverse. But you're right that it's one very concrete way how you can also intervene through specific like activities.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Yeah, well, at least one final one more question. So two of the causes of the rising inequality you named were globalization and then technological advancements. Do policies like basically like neoliberal policy changes, did they affect inequality or is that really?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we see this neoliberalization everywhere. And
yeah.
For example, we saw that, for example, for me, a big surprise was how much has segregation increased in Stockholm. It was quite amazing because for us it's like a typical social democratic welfare state. How on earth? But in Sweden there is a very strong liberalization of the housing sector, and it's ready for decades. And you really see that its effect is a very rapid growth. We don't see the same thing taking place in Oslo. It's also market-based, the housing sector there, but there are much more like social benefits. I mean, it's a rich country with the oil revenues, so they are kind of able to a bit equalize these differences. But yes, in Stockholm, the housing sector has become very market-based, and the segregation increased immediately a lot.
But don't you also think that like ideological changes in the world have affected this? Because I've learned in sociology that like a really small preference for a certain group or probably your own group can lead to huge segregation.
Exactly.
So I think lately with like all the vluchtelingen, how do you say? Refugees and everything, and like the bad image of, for example, Muslims may have also influenced segregation.
Yeah, exactly. That's the classic bottle of Schelling from 1971 already that showed that, I mean, really a small preference towards own group will ultimately lead in a big difference. So that's absolutely true, and that's what we see actually taking place now in the cities. And what we see that, as we said, there is a kind of generation jump between place of residence and schools. And what our studies clearly show that natives with families with kids, they tend to move out from the poorer neighborhoods because immigrants, they tend to be poorer, their families are bigger. So actually the effect of immigration is bigger in schools than in society at large. And so the native families, very often, they kind of choose their place of residence based on the school quality, and that is poorly related to the kind of thinking about the future of the kids, but it very strongly actually affects the way segregation gets transmitted from place of residence to schools, to kids, and then we get this, and then the ethnic and social kind of dimensions tend to overlap because ethnic minorities tend to be poorer. Then we get the second generation immigrant problem from there, and so on. So it's complicated.